I found out my husband had drained our last account the same night he locked me out of the bedroom and told me to sleep on it. My phone buzzed with the bank alert while I stood in the hallway holding our youngest's favorite blanket, my breath fogging in the cold air from the open window. Balance, $0. Just like that, the marriage I thought was built on partnership revealed itself as a trap. For years, I had believed what he told me, that I was bad with money, that it was safer if he handled the accounts. He called it protection. I called it trust. What it really was, I learned too late, was control dressed up as love. My name is Angela, and until that night, I thought I had a husband who provided. I had 2 children who felt safe. I had a life that made sense from the outside. Inside, though, there had always been rules. If I wanted groceries, I asked. If I wanted gas, I texted. If I needed shoes for the kids, I had to explain why the old ones wouldn't do. He kept the cards. He kept the passwords. He kept the narrative that I couldn't be trusted with numbers, that I spent emotionally, that if I were in charge, we'd lose everything. Sometimes he said it kindly. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes, when he was angry, he said it like a verdict. You'd be broke without me. I didn't argue. I loved him. I wanted peace, and I believed that marriage meant compromise, even when that compromise kept me small. That night, the argument wasn't even about money, it was about respect. I had asked to see the statements, not because I suspected anything, because I wanted to learn, because I wanted to understand what we had. He stared at me like I'd just insulted him. "Why do you need that?" he asked. "You don't understand this stuff." I told him I was tired of feeling like a child in my own house. He told me I was ungrateful. When I didn't back down, his voice went cold. "You want control? Then you can see what no control looks like." He walked past me into the bedroom and locked the door. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence on the other side. Our kids were asleep, their breathing soft through the walls. My phone lit up in my hand with that alert, and suddenly the words he'd said for years, "You'd be broke without me," stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a plan. I tried the account again. Nothing. I tried the savings I didn't even know existed until a month before. Nothing. The joint credit card declined when I tested it with a $5 charge at the corner store. I sat on the couch and felt something inside me collapse and sharpen at the same time. He had taken everything. The next morning, I packed what I could fit into 2 duffel bags. He didn't stop me. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, eyes steady, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You'll be back," he said. "You always realize you need me." I looked at him. At the man I had married, the man who kissed our children goodnight, the man who controlled our entire financial world, and I realized something terrifying and freeing all at once. Needing someone is not the same as being loved by them. I took the kids to my sister's for what I told myself would be just a few days. By the end of the week, I understood that I had no access to our money, no credit in my name, and no way to pay for anything without asking someone else. I had built a home on trust, and he had turned that trust into a cage. When my sister told me she couldn't keep us much longer, I nodded like I expected it. Pride is loud until survival needs the room. We slept in my car the first night I couldn't figure out another option. The kids asked if we were camping. I said yes, because the truth felt too heavy to put on their small shoulders. I cried after they fell asleep. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the years I'd spent believing that protection looked like permission, for every time I'd let him decide what I was capable of. The mornings were worse than the nights. Nights were quiet. Mornings demanded solutions: food, gas, school, clean clothes. I went to the library because it was warm and free, because nobody asked questions if you kept your head down. I Googled things I had never needed to know: how to open a bank account with no money, how to check your credit, how to survive when you are suddenly the only adult in the room. I learned fast. I learned that my credit didn't exist because it had never been allowed to. I learned that every bill, every lease, every loan had been in his name. I learned that what he called taking care of things had erased me from my own life. But I also learned something else, something I hadn't expected. I wasn't broken. I was untrained, and training can be learned. I found a women's resource center on a flyer taped inside the library bathroom. I went because I had nothing to lose. They didn't ask why I stayed so long. They didn't ask what I did to deserve it. They asked what I needed. I said, I need to stop being afraid of money. The counselor looked at me gently and said, then we'll start there. That was the first time anyone had spoken to me like I had a future that didn't include him. Weeks turned into months of sleeping wherever I could, working wherever I was hired, learning what interest rates meant, what credit utilization was, how to read a statement without shame. I opened my first account with $20 I'd saved in a coffee cup. I paid a secured card on time, every time. I taught my children that we were building something new, even if the foundation looked like nothing to the world. And then, one afternoon, while I was filling out paperwork for a job that paid just enough to keep us moving forward, my phone rang. It was him. His voice sounded different, careful, curious. Angela, he said, like my name was something he was just learning to pronounce. We should talk. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath, because I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever he was about to say was going to test everything I had built since the night he took everything from me. And I wasn't sure yet whether I was ready for what that conversation would reveal. When his name flashed across my phone, my first instinct was to ignore it. Not because I was afraid of him anymore, but because I was afraid of myself. Afraid that some old reflex might still exist inside me, that the woman who once believed control was care might still be reachable if he used the right tone, the right memory, the right promise. I let it ring out. Then he texted, "We need to talk. You can't keep doing this." I stared at the words until they blurred. Keep doing what? Surviving without him? Existing beyond his permission? That night, after the kids were asleep in the back seat, I called him. Say what you need to say, I told him. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded steadier. He sighed, as if burdened by my independence. You're making this harder than it has to be. You don't have money. You don't have credit. You can't just start over. There it was. The same sentence he'd used for years, just dressed in concern instead of authority. I already have, I said. Silence followed. Then his voice sharpened. Where are you staying? None of your business. You have my kids, Angela. That makes it my business. I felt something rise in my chest. Heat, not fear. They're safe, I said. That's more than I can say about our marriage. He laughed softly, the sound that used to make me shrink. You think sleeping in your car is safe. I didn't answer, because the truth was complicated. It wasn't safe, but it was honest. It wasn't comfortable, but it was mine. You're proving my point, he continued. You can't manage on your own. You need structure. You need someone who knows how money works. What he meant was, you need me to control it again. I hung up. I cried after, quietly, with my jacket pulled over my head so the kids wouldn't hear. Not because he was right, but because part of me was still learning how to exist without being told who I was. The next day, I walked into the Women's Resource Center with the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. The counselor, Miss Denise, remembered my name. She didn't look at me like I was broken. She looked at me like I was building something and just needed the right tools. We sat in a small office that smelled like coffee and paper. She spread brochures across the desk. Financial literacy classes, emergency housing, job placement, credit rebuilding programs. Start with one thing, she said gently. Control the part you can control. I told her the truth I'd been afraid to admit. I don't even know how to read a bank statement. She smiled. Not pity, respect. Then that's where we began. That week, I attended my first financial workshop. I sat in a circle of women whose stories felt like echoes of mine. Different faces, different ages, same pattern. Men who said love while practicing control. Systems that erased us, fear disguised as protection. We learned words I'd never heard in my own marriage. Assets, liabilities, interest, credit utilization, financial abuse. Financial abuse. The phrase hit me like a mirror. That's what it was. Not just being bad with money, not just letting him handle things. It was deliberate isolation from knowledge, from access, from autonomy. And once I could name it, I could no longer excuse it. I opened my first bank account 2 days later. $20, my name only. I stared at the receipt like it was a diploma. The kids and I moved from the car to a temporary shelter the following week. It wasn't home, but it was warm, clean, and safe. They gave us beds, hot meals, a locker for our things, stability, even if it was borrowed. Every night after the kids fell asleep, I studied. I watched videos on budgeting. I read articles on rebuilding credit. I wrote down terms and definitions like I was in school again. I practiced on imaginary numbers because real ones still felt too fragile to risk. One afternoon, my phone rang again. His name. I didn't ignore it this time. "You've made your point," he said. "I'm mad, I get it, but this isn't sustainable. Come home, we can reset things. I'll give you an allowance, more than before. We'll start fresh." Allowance. Like I was a child asking for lunch money. "I don't want an allowance," I said. "I want access." "You don't need access," he snapped. "That's why it works." "No," I replied quietly. "That's why it doesn't." His tone shifted then, harder, more dangerous. "You're being stubborn. You're going to lose everything." I thought about the library, the shelter, the women in that workshop who had already lost everything and still found their way back to themselves. I already lost what mattered. You. He hung up on me. That night, something inside me finally settled. I wasn't running anymore. I was building. Weeks turned into months. I found a job at a grocery warehouse, long hours, physical work, but steady pay. I opened a secured credit card with the help of the counselor and paid it off every month like my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. The kids adjusted better than I expected. Children understand safety even when they don't understand circumstances. We ate simple meals, we shared one bed sometimes, we laughed in places that weren't meant for laughter. I told them we were creating a new chapter. One afternoon, I checked my credit score for the first time. It was low, but it existed. That number on the screen felt like proof of identity, proof that I was no longer invisible in my own financial life. A week later, I received a message from him that wasn't anger or mockery. It was surprise. He wrote, "I saw the credit report. You opened accounts?" I didn't respond, because I knew what that meant. For the first time since our marriage began, he could no longer say I was incapable. And I also knew, deep down, that he wasn't done trying to pull me back into the version of myself that had needed him. The real test wasn't going to be whether I could survive without him. It was going to be whether I could stand firm when he realized I didn't need him anymore. The first time I realized I didn't panic when his name appeared on my phone, I knew something inside me had changed. Not healed, not finished, but anchored. I was standing in line at the warehouse, boots dusty, hands sore from a 12-hour shift, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, not out of fear this time, but out of focus. Life had become a series of tasks. Clock in, work, pick up the kids, study at night, sleep in pieces. I checked it anyway. A text. "You don't have to live like this." I stared at the words and felt nothing. Not anger, not longing, not guilt. Just clarity. Because what he meant was, you don't have to live without me controlling everything. But what I heard was, you don't have to be free. I didn't reply. The days were still hard. Shelter rules, shared kitchens, curfews, thin walls that carried other people's pain through the night. But the structure gave me something I'd never had before, predictability that didn't belong to him. Every paycheck went into my account. Every bill had my name on it. Every choice was mine. I kept a notebook in my bag labeled money. It wasn't fancy, just pages of scribbles, budgeting categories, credit tips, reminders to pay the card early, goals I was too scared to say out loud. Home, car, safety. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the small desk in the shelter's common room, calculator beside me, bills spread out like a puzzle. I tracked every dollar. I learned where it went. I learned what stayed. I had never done that in my marriage, not because I was incapable, because I was never allowed. That realization still burned. Some nights, exhaustion hit so hard it felt like gravity. I would lean against the wall in the bathroom and let the tears come silently. I cried for what we'd lost, our home, our routines, the illusion of stability I'd once clung to. I cried because rebuilding is lonely work, but I didn't cry for him. I cried for the version of me that had been convinced she couldn't survive without permission. And every time I stood back up, that version faded a little more. One afternoon, Miss Denise pulled me aside after a workshop. "You're moving fast," she said, not recklessly, intentionally. I shrugged. "I don't have a choice." She shook her head gently. "You always have a choice. You're choosing ownership." Ownership. The word stayed with me. That night I looked it up in my notebook. Ownership. The state of having, controlling, or possessing something. For the first time in my adult life, I was possessing my own life. He tried again 2 weeks later. This time he showed up. I was walking the kids back from the community center when I saw his car parked across the street. My body reacted before my mind could, shoulders tightening, breath catching, old instincts waking up. He stepped out slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal. "Angela," he said softly, "can we talk?" I looked at my children, then back at him. "About what?" He glanced around, taking in the modest building, the people passing by, the life that was clearly not his anymore. "I locked you out of our life," I said calmly. "You took everything and told me I'd come crawling back." His jaw tightened. I was angry. "No," I replied, "you were in control." Silence fell between us. "I can give you access now," he said quickly. "We can set up joint accounts again. I'll teach you. We can do it right this time." Teach me, as if knowledge was something he had always owned. I shook my head. "I'm already learning." He studied my face, searching for the woman who once believed him without question. He didn't find her. "You're making a mistake," he said, frustration leaking through his calm. I met his eyes, steady and unafraid. "No, I made one when I thought love meant surrender." His mouth opened, then closed. I took my kids' hands and walked away. My legs were shaking, but my heart wasn't. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "I am not broke, I am rebuilding." Months passed. I moved from the shelter into a small transitional apartment, 1 bedroom, peeling paint, but a door that locked and a kitchen that belonged to us. I hung the kids' drawings on the wall. I cooked meals that tasted like effort and hope. My credit score climbed slowly, number by number. Each increase felt like a small rebellion against the life I'd been told I could never manage. I bought my first piece of furniture with my own card, a used couch from a thrift store. I sat on it with the kids, laughing at how it squeaked when we moved. It wasn't luxury, it was ownership. One evening, as I balanced the month's budget, my phone buzzed again. Another message from him. "I know you think you're strong now, but you won't always be." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm not strong because I left, I'm strong because I stayed gone." I turned the phone face down, because I could feel it now, the shift in power, the slow, undeniable truth settling into my bones. He no longer held my future in his hands, and the more independent I became, the more desperate his attempts felt. I didn't know what he would try next, but this I knew. I was no longer the woman he could break by taking my money, and whatever came after this, I would meet it standing. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, disguised as responsibility. By the time I realized I was no longer afraid of the numbers in my bank account, I was already living a life I never thought I could manage alone. I knew exactly how much came in every week. I knew where it went. I knew what was left. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was mysterious. Nothing belonged to anyone else. And that scared him more than anything ever had. He stopped pretending it was about reconciliation. The messages changed tone. "You're hurting the kids by dragging this out. You're being selfish. You think you're better than me now?" I read them without responding, not because they didn't sting, but because I could finally recognize manipulation when I saw it. One afternoon, I was at work when my phone rang. Not his number, an unknown one. "This is Mr. Dawson from Legal Services," the man said. "Your husband is requesting a modification of custody based on financial instability." I felt the floor shift beneath me. There it was. The move I had known would come eventually. Control through money had failed, so now he would try control through fear. He wanted my children, not because he was suddenly concerned, but because he believed I was still powerless without him. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the small kitchen table in our apartment, staring at the court notice. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was trying to do. I had left with nothing. I had built everything from scratch, and now he was trying to use the very ground I had climbed onto as a weapon against me. I went to the resource center the next morning. Miss Denise listened quietly as I explained, my words tumbling out faster than I could contain them. "He's saying I'm unstable, that I can't provide, that the kids would be better off with him." She folded her hands calmly. "Can he prove that?" I hesitated. "I don't know. He has money. He has accounts. He always did." She looked at me steadily. "And you have records." That word again, records. She helped me organize everything I had: pay stubs, lease agreements, utility bills in my name, school enrollment forms, attendance records, documentation from the shelter, letters from the counselors who had worked with my children, proof of consistency, proof of care, proof of stability. For the first time, I saw my survival laid out, not as chaos, but as structure. I wasn't scrambling anymore. I was building a case. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom in a blazer I'd bought secondhand for $10. It wasn't expensive, but it fit. It made me stand taller. I held my folder like it was a shield. He sat across from me in a suit I recognized, one I'd seen him wear to events when I was still asking permission to spend grocery money. He didn't look angry. He looked confident. His attorney spoke first. Words like financial instability, unreliable housing, and lack of resources filled the room. He painted a picture of me as reckless, emotional, incapable. The old Angela might have folded. This one didn't. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I raised my evidence. I showed the judge my income, my lease, my credit statements, my budget spreadsheets, letters from counselors who had watched my children grow safer, happier, more grounded since we left. I spoke about routine, about bedtime, about meals, about showing up. I didn't argue. I documented. And as I spoke, I watched his confidence crack, not dramatically, but subtly, like something he believed was unmovable was quietly shifting. The judge asked him a question that changed everything. "Why," she said evenly, "did you remove her access to the accounts without notice?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, because there was no explanation that didn't sound exactly like what it was: control. The ruling was swift. Custody remained with me. He was granted limited visitation. The courtroom didn't erupt. No one clapped. There was no dramatic music, just a quiet confirmation that my children were staying with the person who had fought to protect them when protection required sacrifice. Outside the building, my legs finally gave way. I sat on the steps and cried, not out of fear, not out of pain, but out of release. I had walked into that courtroom as the woman he once said would be nothing without him. I walked out as the mother who had proven otherwise. That night, I tucked my children into bed and watched them breathe, their faces soft in sleep. I realized something then that settled deep in my chest. He had taken my money. He had taken my comfort. He had taken years of my autonomy, but he would never take my future. And as I stood there in the quiet, I understood that I was no longer just rebuilding. I was reclaiming. The only question left now was how far I was willing to go with the woman I was becoming. Winning in court didn't feel like victory. It felt like validation, not because I needed a judge to tell me I was a good mother, but because for years I had been told I was incapable, bad with money, too emotional, too dependent, too weak to manage life without him. And in one quiet ruling, all of that collapsed under the weight of evidence. Still, the aftermath was harder than the hearing itself. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Control doesn't disappear just because it's challenged. It mutates. The call started again, this time masked as concern. "How are the kids doing? Do you need help with groceries? You know I could make things easier." Every offer carried a condition I didn't need spelled out. "Depend on me again." I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining my boundaries to someone who only heard them as obstacles. Life became real. No fantasy of rescue, no safety net, just responsibility stacked on top of responsibility. I woke before sunrise, packed lunches, got the kids ready for school, worked long shifts, studied budgeting at night, and collapsed into bed with exhaustion that felt earned. There were days I wanted to scream, when the car wouldn't start, when rent swallowed most of my paycheck, when the kids needed new shoes and I had to choose between now and later. I was doing everything alone, and yet I had never felt more capable. I learned to say no to impulse. I learned to plan meals a week ahead. I learned that small choices made consistently were more powerful than one grand gesture of control. One night, while reviewing my budget, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. For the first time since leaving him, I had money left over. Not much, just enough to acknowledge, but it was mine. I stared at the numbers like they might disappear if I blinked. This wasn't survival. This was progress. The next week, I went to the bank and did something that felt almost ceremonial. I opened a savings account, $10 to start. The teller smiled kindly. Everyone starts somewhere. I walked out holding the receipt like it was a promise. At the same time, his tone shifted again. The messages stopped being persuasive. They became sharp. You think you're independent now. You're still nothing without me. You're going to fail, and when you do, don't come begging. I read them without shaking, because I finally understood something he never expected me to learn. Threats only work when you believe you deserve them. I didn't anymore. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. Not from him, from a bank. It was a credit pre-approval. A small one, limited, cautious, but real. My name was printed at the top like I belonged in that world now. I laughed out loud in my kitchen, this tiny apartment that was still mostly empty, but already full of possibility. I had credit. I had options. I had proof. That night, I told the kids we were building something together. A house? My youngest asked, eyes wide. Not yet, I smiled, but someday. They didn't question it. They believed me because they saw the work, because they felt the difference between fear and stability, because they knew I wasn't waiting for anyone to save us anymore. Months passed. My credit score rose, my savings grew, my confidence hardened into something unshakable, and with every step forward, his shadow grew smaller, until the day he showed up again. Not at my job, not at the shelter, not at court, at my apartment. I opened the door and found him standing there, eyes scanning the space like he was trying to calculate something. "This is where you live now?" he asked, disbelief edging his voice. I stepped into the doorway, blocking his view. "This is where we live," I corrected. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You really think this is winning?" I looked at him, the man who once controlled every dollar, every decision, every future plan, and felt no fear, just clarity. "I think," I said calmly, "that I finally understand what freedom costs." He stared at me, searching for the woman he used to know. She was gone, and in her place stood someone he had never anticipated, someone who no longer needed his permission to exist, someone who was no longer afraid of what she could build alone. I closed the door gently, not to be dramatic, but because some chapters don't need arguments to end. And as I leaned against the wall, heart steady, I realized something else. I wasn't just rebuilding my life anymore. I was redefining what success meant on my own terms. And the next step I was about to take would prove just how far I had come. The next step didn't arrive with a grand announcement. It arrived disguised as paperwork, applications, forms, fine print, the kind of work that doesn't look powerful from the outside, but changes everything once it's done. After he showed up in my apartment, something inside me clicked with finality. Not anger, not fear, resolve. I was tired of reacting to the damage he'd done. I wanted to build something that existed beyond his reach, beyond his opinions, beyond his shadow. Not just stability, security. I went back to the Women's Resource Center the next morning and told Miss Denise what I wanted. "I don't just want to survive anymore," I said. "I want to own something. I want a future that can't be taken away because someone else decides I don't deserve access." She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then it's time to think long term," she said. We started with the basics: education, certifications, job training programs that paid more than hourly wages. I enrolled in a financial literacy course that went deeper than budgeting: investing fundamentals, retirement planning, how mortgages work, how wealth is built quietly over time. Every lesson felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been withheld. I learned how money moves, how credit grows, how debt traps people when they don't understand the rules. And I learned how often women, especially mothers, are taught to depend instead of decide. I wasn't doing that anymore. I switched jobs 3 months later. It wasn't glamorous, administrative work at a logistics company, but it came with benefits, predictable hours, and most importantly, growth. My first paycheck felt different. Not because it was huge, because it was mine. I updated my budget, increased my savings, paid my credit card down to near zero, watched my score tick upward again. One night, while the kids slept and the apartment was quiet, I logged into my banking app and stared at the numbers. For the first time since my marriage ended, I could see more than just next week. I could see next year. And for the first time in my life, that future belonged to me. That was when I did something I never would have dared to do before. I met with a financial advisor. I walked into her office wearing a secondhand blazer and shoes that still had scuffs from the thrift store. I felt small for about 5 seconds. Then I remembered everything I had survived. I want to know how to build something that lasts, I told her. She didn't look at me like I was foolish. She looked at me like I was serious. We talked about goals, emergency funds, long-term savings, home ownership. Home. The word sat in my chest like a promise I wasn't sure I was allowed to make yet. But she didn't laugh. She said, "It's possible. Not immediately, but if you stay consistent, absolutely." I walked out of that office feeling taller than I ever had in my marriage because no one was deciding what I was capable of for me anymore. Of course, he didn't disappear. He never fully did. He sent messages through relatives, asked about the kids through friends, tried to position himself as the stable one, the reasonable one, the one who still cared. But I had learned the language behind those gestures. They weren't about love. They were about relevance. And he was losing his. One evening, after I tucked the kids into bed, I found an old notebook in the back of a drawer, the one I'd started months ago, the one labeled money. Pages of messy handwriting, crossed out numbers, early budgets that barely worked. I flipped through it slowly. Every page told the story of a woman learning something she had never been allowed to know. Not just how to manage money, but how to trust herself. I added a new page at the end. Goals. Emergency fund, 1,000 to 5,000. Debt-free. Credit score, 700 plus. Home ownership. I underlined the last one twice, not because I was close, but because I believed in it. The kids started asking questions about money too. "Why do you write everything down?" my oldest asked one night. "So we don't forget what belongs to us," I said. "What belongs to us?" he asked. "Our future," I replied. He smiled like that made perfect sense, and maybe it did. Weeks later, I received an email that made my hand shake. Pre-qualification for a small personal loan. Not for spending, for building. I didn't accept it. I didn't need it, but I saved the email because it was proof that the world I had once been locked out of was now opening one door at a time. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something that stopped my breath. I was no longer defined by what he had taken from me. I was defined by what I was creating, and the woman who had once been told she was bad with money was quietly becoming someone who understood it better than he ever expected. The only question left was how far I was willing to go, and I could feel it now, deep, steady, unshakable. I was just getting started. The moment I realized my life no longer revolved around proving him wrong was the moment everything truly changed. Not because I stopped caring about the damage he caused, but because I stopped measuring my progress against his past. I was building something that didn't need comparison. The weeks blurred into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Work, school drop-offs, cooking dinner, studying budgets after the kids fell asleep, tracking savings, watching my credit score inch upward like a quiet promise that the future was responding to my discipline. I stopped feeling like I was starting over. I was starting forward. One afternoon, I sat at my desk at work when my phone buzzed with a message from my financial advisor. "You're officially in the strong profile range now. Keep going." I stared at the screen, a smile slowly spreading across my face. Strong profile. The words felt unreal. For years, my financial identity had been dependent, irresponsible, incapable. Now it was reliable, consistent, disciplined. No one handed me that. I earned it. The kids noticed the changes before I did. Our fridge stayed full. We didn't stress over gas money. When school sent home a permission slip for a field trip, I didn't hesitate. That kind of normal felt extraordinary. Then one evening, after dinner, my oldest asked something that caught me off guard. "Are we poor anymore?" I paused, searching for a truthful answer that wouldn't carry fear. "We're building," I said gently. "We're not where we want to be yet, but we're not where we used to be." He nodded like he understood something bigger than numbers. "I like this better," he said. So did I. But just when life started to feel steady, he tried again. Not with anger, not with threats, with vulnerability. The message came late one night. "I miss you. I made mistakes. We were supposed to do this together." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, not from longing, but from memory. There was a time when that message would have broken me open, when I would have wondered if I was being too harsh, too proud, too independent for my own good. But I wasn't that woman anymore, because I finally understood what together had meant in our marriage. It meant I gave and he decided. I trusted and he controlled. I depended and he dominated. That wasn't partnership. That was possession. I typed one sentence. We weren't building together. I was disappearing. Then I turned the phone off. For the first time in my life, I didn't second-guess the decision. I didn't wonder if I was wrong. I knew I was free. A month later, I reached a milestone that felt almost impossible when I first left. My emergency fund crossed $2,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was safety. Real, tangible safety. The kind that means you don't panic when the car makes a strange noise. The kind that means you don't stay in bad situations because you can't afford to leave. The kind that changes how you breathe. I sat at my kitchen table that night, notebook open, pen in hand, staring at the numbers. I thought about the woman I had been the night I found our account drained, standing in the hallway, clutching a blanket, believing I had nothing. If she could see me now, she wouldn't recognize herself. Not because I was rich, not because life was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid of my own capability. And then something happened that made my heart pound in a different way. An email. You may be eligible for first-time home buyer counseling. I read it 3 times. Home. Not yet, not soon, but someday. And for the first time, someday didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a plan. That night, I tucked the kids in and sat on the edge of the bed watching them sleep. We're going to have a house one day, I whispered into the quiet. One that's ours. Not his, not borrowed, not controlled. Ours. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew something deeper than certainty. I was no longer rebuilding from loss. I was constructing a future he would never have access to. And with every dollar saved, every lesson learned, every boundary kept, I was becoming a woman he could no longer define. The next chapter of my life wasn't about escape anymore. It was about ownership. and the foundation was already in place. The idea of owning a home started as a whisper in my mind, not a fantasy, not a dream too big to touch, a goal. And once something becomes a goal, it changes how you move through the world. I enrolled in the first-time home buyer counseling program the very next week. It was held in a small community center classroom with folding chairs and coffee that tasted like it had been reheated too many times. Most of the people there looked like me, tired, hopeful, carrying stories behind their eyes that no one had asked to hear. The counselor started with one sentence that landed deep in my chest. Home ownership is not about how much you make, it's about how well you prepare. I had been preparing my entire life without realizing it. We talked about down payments, debt-to-income ratios, credit profiles, pre-approvals. Numbers that once would have terrified me now felt like a language I was finally fluent in. I took notes like my future depended on it, because it did. After class, I stayed behind and asked questions until the room emptied. "What if your past is messy?" I asked. The counselor smiled gently. "Most people's is. What matters is what you've done with it." I walked out with a folder full of information and a quiet certainty growing inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was positioning. At work, I asked about advancement, not out of desperation, but strategy. Within 2 months, I was promoted to a supervisory role. The raise wasn't life-changing, but it was life-shifting. I updated my budget that night, moving numbers, recalculating goals. Emergency fund? Growing. Debt? Shrinking. Credit? Climbing. And for the first time, I saw a path instead of a wall. Of course, he noticed. He always did. This time, the message wasn't emotional. It was calculated. "I heard you got a better job," he wrote. "Good for you. Guess you didn't need me after all." I read it slowly, recognizing the subtle shift in tone. Not control, comparison. He wasn't trying to bring me back anymore. He was trying to remind himself he still mattered. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the truth was already doing the talking. One evening, after a long day, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, budgeting for the next 6 months. My youngest sat beside me, coloring. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm planning," I said. "For what?" I paused. "For our house." He looked up, eyes bright. "With a yard?" I smiled. "With a yard." "And my own room?" "Yes." "And a door I can close?" I laughed softly. "Yes." He grinned and went back to coloring like it was already real. Maybe that was the moment it became real for me too. The weeks that followed were full of discipline. No unnecessary spending, no shortcuts, no emotional purchases. I learned the difference between want and need in ways I never had before, not because I was deprived, but because I was intentional. Every dollar had a job now. Every choice had a direction. I stopped feeling like money was something that happened to me. It was something I directed. Then came the call from the home buyer program. "Based on your profile," the counselor said, "you're not ready to buy today, but if you keep going the way you are, you will be." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. Not yet, but soon. And suddenly, time felt like an ally instead of an enemy. That night, after the kids were asleep, I stood by the window in our apartment looking out at the quiet street below. I thought about the woman who once believed control was care, the woman who thought asking permission was safety, the woman who was convinced she couldn't survive without a man who monitored every dollar. She had no idea what she was capable of, and I felt something else then, something powerful and gentle all at once. Gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the awakening. Because if he had never taken everything, I might never have learned how much I could build on my own. The path ahead was still long, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like something I was walking into blindly. It felt like something I was designing, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. And the house I would one day stand in would not just be a place to live, it would be proof. Proof that I had turned loss into literacy, control into clarity, and survival into ownership. I didn't know exactly when I would unlock that door, but I knew without a single doubt left in my body, I was already on my way. Momentum changes everything. Once I stopped asking if a better future was possible and started planning for when it would happen, my entire life rearranged itself around that certainty. Not magically, not overnight, but deliberately. I created a separate account labeled House Fund and transferred money into it every payday, no matter how small the amount. $50 some weeks, $100 on good ones. I told myself it didn't matter how fast I moved, only that I never stopped. Saving wasn't just financial anymore. It was psychological. Every deposit was proof that I believed in the woman I was becoming. At work, I began taking on more responsibility, not because anyone demanded it, but because I wanted my future to reflect my effort. I volunteered for projects others avoided. I learned processes outside my job description. I asked questions the old me would have been too intimidated to ask. When my manager pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You've changed," I knew exactly what she meant. I had. I wasn't afraid of being seen as capable anymore. I was afraid of staying small. And then something unexpected happened. He called. Not with bitterness, not with control, with something that sounded dangerously close to admiration. "I heard you're doing really well," he said. I didn't reply immediately, not because I was trying to be cold, because I was finally aware of how much power words used to have over me and how little they did now. "Yeah," I said simply. "I am." There was a pause on the line. "I didn't think you could do it on your own," he admitted. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It was something else. Realization, the truth he had never allowed himself to consider. And for the first time, I understood something that brought a strange kind of peace. His doubt was never about my ability. It was about his need to feel necessary. "You were wrong," I said gently. Silence, then a breath. "I guess I was." We ended the call without anger, without closure, without needing either. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Months passed. My savings crossed milestones I once thought were unreachable. My credit score climbed into the range lenders actually respected. My emergency fund gave me something I'd never had before: options. One evening, after reviewing my finances, I opened the email from the homebuyer counselor again. "You may be eligible to begin pre-qualification review." My hands trembled, not from fear, from readiness. I gathered documents the way I had once gathered survival tools, carefully, completely, without apology. Pay stubs, tax forms, bank statements, proof of income, proof of stability, proof of me. I submitted everything and waited. Waiting used to terrify me because waiting meant uncertainty. But now waiting felt different. It felt earned. While I waited, life continued in quiet, meaningful ways. I cooked dinner with the kids and talked about what kind of house we wanted someday. I drove past neighborhoods I once thought were for other people and imagined us there. Not wishing, planning. Then the email arrived. "You are approved for preliminary pre-qualification review." I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my chest. Pre-qualified. Not for a mansion, not for anything extravagant, but for something real, something mine. I sat at the kitchen table and cried, not the desperate tears of loss, but the full, heavy tears of arrival. because the woman who had once slept in her car with 2 children, believing she had nothing, now had something no one could take from her: knowledge, stability, power. I looked at the kids laughing in the living room and felt a surge of emotion I didn't have words for. This wasn't just about a house. This was about breaking a cycle of dependence, of silence, of believing I wasn't capable. I had been told I was bad with money. I had been told I needed control. I had been told I couldn't do this alone. And yet, here I was, standing on the edge of something I once thought was reserved for people stronger, smarter, better than me, people who had always belonged. But belonging isn't something you're given, it's something you claim. And as I sat there, the quiet hum of possibility filling the room, I realized something that made my heart feel impossibly full. I wasn't just about to buy a house. I was about to buy back every version of myself I had been told I could never become. The final steps were still ahead: paperwork, decisions, fear, faith. But I could feel it now. The end of the story was no longer about survival. It was about ownership. And the door I was preparing to walk through would change everything. Pre-qualification didn't feel real until I held the letter in my hands. I printed it out like I was afraid it might vanish if it stayed on a screen. My name, my income, my approval, all laid out in black ink, official and undeniable. This wasn't charity. This wasn't luck. This wasn't someone letting me have something. This was mine. The next step was meeting with a loan officer. I walked into her office with my folder tucked under my arm like armor. Every document was organized, labeled, intentional. I knew what each number meant now. I understood what I was asking for and what I was capable of sustaining. She reviewed everything carefully. "You've done a lot in a short amount of time," she said, looking up at me. "Your credit history shows discipline. Your income is stable. Your debt is manageable." She smiled. "You're a strong applicant." Strong. That word followed me out of the building like a crown I never knew I was allowed to wear. The kids celebrated with me that night in the only way we could afford: takeout pizza and sparkling apple juice in mismatched cups. They didn't understand interest rates or loan structures, but they understood something far more important. Mom had done something big. "We're really going to have our own house?" my youngest asked. "Yes," I said, "we are." He hugged me so tight it knocked the breath from my lungs. I started touring homes on weekends. Nothing fancy, modest neighborhoods, small yards, houses with stories in their walls and potential in their bones. I walked through empty living rooms imagining where the couch would go. I stood in kitchens picturing school lunches and late-night talks. I opened closet doors like they were gateways into a future that once felt unreachable. Some houses were too expensive. Some needed more work than I could take on. Some just didn't feel right. And then I found it. A small 3-bedroom with peeling paint, an overgrown yard, and a porch that sagged slightly under its own age. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Sunlight poured through the front windows like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. The bedrooms were small but warm. The kitchen smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The backyard wasn't much, but it was ours. I stood in the center of the living room, heart pounding, and knew, this is it. I put in an offer that night. The waiting returned, but this time waiting felt different. This wasn't uncertainty. This was anticipation. I checked my email obsessively. I replayed every step in my mind, wondering if I'd missed something, if I'd miscalculated, if I was asking too much of a world that had never given me anything easily. And then, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon at work, my phone buzzed. Offer accepted. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I walked into the bathroom and locked the door, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. Tears streamed down my face before I could stop them. I pressed my palm against my mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. I had done it. Not because someone saved me, not because someone gave me access, not because someone decided I was finally worthy, but because I had learned, because I had built, because I had refused to disappear. When I told the kids that night, they screamed like I just told them we were going to Disneyland. "We have a house!" my oldest yelled, jumping on the bed. "Our house," I said softly. They didn't hear the difference, but I felt it in every cell of my body. Of course, the paperwork was endless. Inspections, appraisals, signatures, disclosures. Every document was another test of patience, another reminder that this world had rules I once was locked out of. But now, I knew how to read them. I knew what questions to ask. I knew when to push back. I wasn't walking into this blind. I was walking in prepared. One evening, while reviewing the final closing documents, I paused and looked around our little apartment, at the bare walls, the thrifted furniture, the life we had rebuilt piece by piece. This place had saved us, but it was no longer our future. It was our foundation. And as I signed my name on the last page, my hand steady, my heart full, I felt something powerful and quiet settle inside me. This wasn't just a house. This was proof. Proof that control had not broken me. Proof that silence had not erased me. Proof that the woman who was once told she was bad with money was now the one holding the keys to her own future. The closing date was set, and with it came the final chapter of a journey that began the night I thought I had lost everything. I didn't know exactly what it would feel like to walk through that door for the first time, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When I did, I would not be walking in as a survivor. I would be walking in as an owner. The days between acceptance and closing felt longer than the years it took to get there. Everything moved in slow motion. Inspections, appraisals, more emails than I could count, forms that needed initials on every page, conversations filled with terms that once would have scared me, escrow, contingencies, title insurance, but now felt like a language I had finally earned the right to speak. Still, anxiety crept in at night, not doubt about myself, fear of losing what I had almost touched. What if something went wrong? What if I missed something in the paperwork? What if the world decided at the last minute that I didn't belong here after all? I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to my children breathe in the quiet dark, reminding myself of everything I had already survived. I had lived in my car. I had rebuilt my credit from nothing. I had faced him in court. I had stood alone when being alone felt impossible. I could survive disappointment. But I wanted this more than anything. The inspection came back with minor issues, nothing structural, nothing dangerous, a leaky faucet, old wiring in the garage, the kind of things that once would have overwhelmed me. Instead, I made a list. I negotiated. I adjusted, because I wasn't asking permission anymore. I was making decisions. One afternoon, while reviewing updated documents at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed. His name. I stared at it for a long moment. He hadn't called in months. I almost didn't answer. But something told me this was different. "Angela," he said quietly. His voice didn't carry the same confidence it once had. There was no edge, no control, just something small. "I heard you're buying a house." I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I simply said yes. Another pause. "I didn't think you'd actually do it." There it was. Not anger, not jealousy, recognition. The truth he had never allowed himself to believe. "You always said I couldn't," I replied gently. "I didn't mean..." He stopped, started again. I didn't think you'd make it this far. I closed my eyes, not because it hurt, but because it finally didn't. I did, I said. The silence on the other end felt heavy. Then, quietly, I guess you didn't need me after all. No apology, no regret, just the admission that mattered. I didn't respond with bitterness. I responded with truth. I never needed control, I said. I needed respect. He didn't have an answer for that. We ended the call without anger, without closure, without promises. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. The next day, I walked through the house one last time before closing. The air inside was still, untouched. Dust hung in the sunlight like tiny stars. The rooms echoed when I stepped, empty and waiting. I stood in the doorway of what would be my children's rooms, imagining beds, posters, laughter. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter, already picturing school lunches and late-night talks. This house didn't know us yet, but it would. Back at the apartment, I started packing, not because we had to rush, but because I was ready. Each box felt like a farewell to a chapter that had demanded everything from me. The night before closing, I sat on the floor surrounded by half-packed boxes, notebook in my lap. The same one I'd carried through shelters, jobs, exhaustion, doubt. I flipped to the first page, messy numbers, broken budgets, notes written by a woman who didn't yet believe in herself. I turned to the last page, goals. Emergency fund, check. Debt-free, check. Credit score 700, check. Home ownership, tomorrow. My chest tightened. Tomorrow. I looked around the room, the place that held us while we rebuilt. I whispered a thank you to the walls, to the floor, to the life that had caught us when we fell. And then I whispered something else. I did it. Not for him, not for anyone else. For me. For my children. For the woman I became when I stopped apologizing for wanting more. I lay in bed that night, staring into the darkness, heart beating in a rhythm I didn't recognize. It wasn't fear, it was arrival. Because in less than 24 hours, I would walk into an office, sign my name on the final line, and step into a future no one could ever take from me again. But I didn't know what would happen in that room, what final test might still be waiting, what last moment might try to remind me of who I used to be. All I knew was this: tomorrow would change everything. The closing office was smaller than I imagined. No grand room, no ceremony, just a table, a stack of papers, and a woman behind a desk who smiled politely and said, "Congratulations in advance." Advance, as if this moment could still be taken back. I sat down, folder in my lap, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the night everything was taken from me. Not from fear, but from the weight of how far I had come. The attorney explained each document. I followed every word. I asked questions. I understood what I was signing. There was no mystery, no blind trust, no surrender, just clarity. With every signature, something inside me released. The woman who once asked permission to buy groceries, the woman who was told she was irresponsible, the woman who believed she couldn't survive without someone controlling her life. Page by page, I replaced her story with my own. When the final document slid across the table, the room went quiet. "All right," the attorney said gently, "this is the last one." I took the pen. For a moment, my hand hovered above the line, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, the feeling of standing at the edge of something I had built from nothing. I thought about sleeping in my car, about hiding tears so my children wouldn't see, about budgeting down to the dollar, about every late night, every lesson learned, every boundary kept. I thought about the man who once told me I would be nothing without him. And then I signed my name. The sound of the pen on paper was soft, but the meaning was thunder. The attorney smiled. "It's official," she said. "You're a homeowner." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, staring at my name, printed beneath words that said this home belonged to me, not to a husband, not to a system, not to someone who believed control was love. To me. I walked out of that office holding a folder and a set of keys that felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried before. Not because of their weight, because of what they represented: ownership, autonomy, freedom. When I picked up the kids, I didn't say anything right away. I just drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel like I was still convincing myself this was real. "Mom," my oldest said from the back seat, "did we get it?" I pulled over. I turned around and held up the keys. "We're home," I said. They screamed, they laughed, they cried, they hugged me like I had just given them the world. And in a way, I had. The first night in the house, there was no furniture, no decorations, no comfort, just sleeping bags on the floor, pizza boxes, and light pouring through windows that were ours. We lay there together, staring at the ceiling. "It's quiet," my youngest whispered. I smiled. Peace feels like that. Later, when the kids finally fell asleep, I walked through the house alone. I touched the walls, the door frames, the kitchen counter, the backyard fence. This place didn't just hold a future, it held my proof. Proof that control had not broken me. Proof that silence had not erased me. Proof that the woman who had once been told she was bad with money had become the one who owned her own life. I didn't win because I outplayed him. I won because I outgrew him. I didn't rebuild to prove him wrong. I rebuilt to prove myself right. That I was capable. That I was worthy. That I never needed permission to become who I was meant to be. And as I stood there in the quiet, keys in my hand, I realized something that felt like the truest ending of all. I was no longer a woman who had been left broke. I was a woman who had woken up. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.